Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al Monitor, and this week we'll be talking with renowned Middle East scholar Gilles Kepel about his latest book, Away from Chaos, The Middle East and the Challenge to the West, coming up after this short break.
We see that the political language of Islam, which was the key to social peace in the oil era, and which nurtured the competition between conservative Sunni Islamism in Saudi Arabia and so-called revolutionary Shia Islamism in Tehran, is now becoming increasingly irrelevant. What will this lead to? I don't know.
Welcome back to On the Middle East. That's French scholar Gilles Kepel from our interview, which is coming up in just a minute. First, I want to share with you something that's on my mind. Last week, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called Yemen the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Now, while a donor conference hosted virtually by the UN in Saudi Arabia produced $1.35 billion in pledges to help Yemen, and that may seem like a lot of money, but it's actually just more than half of last year's contributions. And that amount is despite a pledge of $500 million, about a little more than a third of the total amount by Saudi Arabia alone. Now, Guterres went on to say that Yemen is hanging by a thread, its institutions are facing near collapse, and its economy is in tatters. The numbers in Yemen are grim. Out of an estimated population of 28 million, a staggering 24 million need assistance, 4 million are displaced, and just this year, 110,000 Yemenis have contracted cholera. Seasonal floods could spark malaria and dengue fever outbreaks soon. Nearly half of the population is under 15, a potentially lost generation of Yemeni children. UN humanitarian coordinator Mark Lowcock said that COVID-19, notice we haven't mentioned that yet, but that COVID-19 is spreading rapidly, and this makes the already dire situation, quote, catastrophic. Now, although as of June 9, there are so far just 496 reported cases of coronavirus in Yemen, there are 112 deaths. Now, that's a fatality rate of over 22.5%, and that's compared to a 5.6% fatality rate worldwide. And of course, most importantly, because of the war and Yemen's broken health infrastructure, the number of infected is believed to be much higher. Now, Yemen should really be too big to fail, and absent a lasting ceasefire and political transition, Yemen, as well as Libya and Syria, where wars continue, all three countries could risk collapse or chronic poverty and fragility for the foreseeable future. Yemen was a fragile, potentially failing state before the war broke out over 5 years ago, and it is now the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, as the UN Secretary General said last week. Guterres tweeted that, quote, ending the war is the only solution in Yemen, and he's right. The UN, Saudi Arabia, and the international community have in recent months backed a ceasefire, but the Yemenis themselves have become fractured, unable to agree among themselves on their future. That's no reason to give up. There's no lasting or sustainable human or economic development or political stability when wars continue. Until there's a ceasefire and a political transition in Yemen, it is really all just triage until then. This week, our guest is Gilles Kepel. He is professor at the Université Paris Sciences et Lettres, PSL, where he is also director of the Middle East and the Mediterranean chair. Gilles is, simply put, a giant in the scholarship on political Islam. His books and articles, including his first book, The Prophet and the Pharaoh, Muslim Extremism in Egypt, as well as subsequent books, Jihad, The Trail of Political Islam, Terror in France, The Rise of Jihad in the West, and many more books and articles. These are, as we say, standard works, required reading. His latest book is Away from Chaos, The Middle East and the Challenge to the West, that just came out in English last month. And that will be the subject of our conversation today with Professor Gilles Kepel, and that starts right now. We are here with Professor Gilles Kepel, and we're going to be talking about his new book, Away from Chaos. Professor Kepel, Gilles, welcome to On the Middle East.
Hello, thank you.
Let's start at the beginning. You talk about your early experiences as a researcher in Syria in the late 1970s and call the introduction to your book A Testament for Syria. Please explain why you start there and how those early experiences in Al-Sham shaped your evolution as a scholar.
Well, you know, in the mid-1970s, for young, at the time I was young, French scholars, we had a training center for Arabic language in Damascus, and this is where we all went. And so Syria was the first country I was exposed, the first Arab country I was exposed to as a young man, and I just loved it. And you know, most people my generation felt the same, and this is why when the terrible things that happened took place in Syria, we were all sort of taken aback. And when I went there last time in 2012, and I crossed the border illegally from Turkey into Syria, I was so moved, and seeing what has happened since then definitely not only broke my heart, but it also looked like it was this ordeal of the Levant was something I was trying as much as I could to overcome. And the very title of the book, Away from Chaos, is an attempt to look forward and to see how we could get out of that catastrophe and try to build something anew out of the ruins.
Gilles, you have done groundbreaking research and scholarship on Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, including, I should add, The Prophet and the Pharaoh, Muslim Extremism in Egypt, which was published in 1985. And of course, your work in subsequent books and articles on Islam, Egypt, and the region. Tell us about how some of the trends you describe in Away from Chaos, your newest book, led to what we call the Arab Spring. And how has it played out in Egypt? I mean, with the resignation of Mubarak, the election and then toppling of Morsi, the Sisi presidency. And has the Brotherhood been dealt a death blow in Egypt following all these events over the last 9 years or so?
It's a long story, of course, but it's, you know, this book, Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West, it is in a way a book about the elapsed half century, starting from the October War or the Yom Kippur or Ramadan War, whatever you prefer, of October 1973, when oil became the commodity of commodities and you know, called the shots in the region and in the world until nowadays. And by chance, this coincided with my life as a scholar, because, as you mentioned, I started in Syria in the late 1970s as a student of the Arabic language, and then I spent 3 years from 1980 to 1983 in Egypt as a young researcher. And I was based in Cairo, and I embarked on a PhD research on Islamist movements. No one was interested at the time. Everybody thought I was totally crazy. But the guys which I followed assassinated Sadat when I was there. And this was, of course, a very striking phenomenon for a young man at the time. And I afterwards, you had much easier access to the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, and even some jihadi or post-jihadi people. But at the time, under Sadat's political repression was at its peak, and it was very difficult to have access. Foreigners were tracked by the secret police all the time. There was no internet, and you had to get information from, if I may say so, from the horse's mouth all the time. But these were very formative years, if I may say so. And for someone like me who ended up sentenced to death by ISIS in 2016, this was, of course, some good first training experience. As of today, this challenge and this competition between the military on the one hand and the Brotherhood on the other, who are in a way two parallel structures that at times sort of cooperated and at times fought against each other to rule Egypt. This whole system started in the early 1980s when I was there, when after Sadat had co-opted the brothers so that they would deal with the sort of the welfare state dimension of the Egyptian regime, of the former Nasser regime, which had crumbled totally because of corruption, because of nepotism, cronyism, and the like. And so over those last 40 years, this sort of, it was more or less of the same story unfolding under different circumstances. When the so-called Arab Springs broke out in January 2011 in Cairo, originally the brothers who had nothing to do with that would not bet on that. But, after 3 days, they decided that, maybe they had some access to the military also, who wanted, the top brass wanted to get rid of Mubarak, and they had sort of let go the movement in Tahrir Square. They kept some of the back streets open so that demonstrators could come, and the brothers decided to take a risk. But at the end of the day, the generals decided that they would rein everything in. And I remember one evening in Cairo meeting one of the leading generals of the SCAF, of the Supreme Committee of the Armed Forces, who had explained to me, this was December 2011, their vision of things. We're going to let the brothers win the elections, and then they're going to be so inept that the people are going to call us back. At the time, I thought this was totally crazy, but this is exactly what happened, with a little help from their friends in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, of course. And I believe that nowadays the brothers have been dealt, for the present time at least, a death blow, because the challenge to the military was too high, and also it's not an Egyptian issue anymore. Egypt is taken hostage by the sort of fault line within the Sunni world, the competition for power between the pro-Qatar groups, i.e. Turkey, Qatar, and the Muslim Brothers, the pro-Brothers group, and the anti-Muslim Brothers bloc, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt. And as long as the balance of forces is not tipped towards the brothers, I don't think that they have a chance to resurface in Egypt. Most of them are either in jail or exiled in Turkey, in Qatar for the time being.
Help us understand, since the overthrow of Gaddafi, how the forces you describe in your book, the trend lines regarding oil, regarding the split in the Sunni bloc, have played out in Libya, and what do you see as the stakes now in that conflict in that country?
Well, Libya, under Gaddafi was a country that had been totally emasculated politically. I mean, Gaddafi reigned over everything. And actually, I visited Libya in those days. And, this was the most horrendous dictatorship that I ever experienced in the Arab world. And, there are some competitors actually for the job. But, he was the worst, clearly. And so he had destroyed everything. And when the sort of upheaval started in Benghazi, in Cyrenaica, in the eastern part of Libya, because the West had not been very responsive to what had happened in Tunisia a few weeks before, then Britain and France decided that they would help the rebels with, as was said at the time, with America leading from behind, to quote from President Obama. And so the West bombed Gaddafi's tanks, destroyed his army, which saved the life of Benghazi's inhabitants at the time. And finally, Gaddafi was stopped by a French strike and killed in unclear circumstances. But the West was unable, just like America had been unable in Iraq, to change military victory into a political success. And the sort of, pre-Gaddafi system rose. Libya was torn in between tribes fighting for control over oil, blended with ideology, pro-brothers, anti-brothers. And then it became the playing field for Sunni competitors for hegemon. In the eastern side in Cyrenaica, you had a very strong backing from Egypt, from the Emirates, and to a lesser extent from Saudi Arabia for General Haftar. And in Tripoli, in the western part of the country, a strong Turkish plus Qatari help for the Tripoli government. Nowadays, to some extent, Libya has become an extension of the Syrian conflict, with Turkey sending to Tripoli, to the pro-brothers and philo-Qatari side of the country, former Syrian rebels crossed into Turkey, got a shower there, and then were shipped to Tripoli to fight against pro-Russian militias and proxies who fight on the side of Marshal Haftar in the east. So, there's some sort of strange echo between Libya as a sort of protracted Syrian battlefront and the Levant. What will come out of it doesn't have much to do with Libya, actually. I think it has to do with the capacity of both Russia and Turkey to sustain this confrontation. Both countries now are in dire straits. Turkey is badly hit both by the coronavirus pandemics and also by sluggish economy. Erdogan is heavily challenged internally, and Russia sort of played the sorcerer's apprentice when Putin decided, to go for this sort of game with the oil prices, and He and the Saudis wanted to oust American shale producers from the markets, opening their fields and producing much more oil. But the COVID crisis hit them back, and now they were badly hit by the crash of the oil markets.
Oh,
Hence, Russia needs cash, and it's probably willing to negotiate, but it's too early to say.
Gilles, tell us about the experience of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. How did it play out there? And do you see that as a success or a model of what might be possible? And where do you see the trajectory in that country?
Well, Tunisia was or still is, the only Arab country where the Arab so-called Spring, because it happened in December 2010, actually, which was not yet spring, was politically a success, i.e., you have democratic institutions in Tunisia. This is the only country that underwent those upheavals in 2010, 2011 that resulted ultimately in a democratic system, in spite of all its shortcomings, economic problems, terrorism, and the like. But it holds. I mean, in Tunisia, you have freedom of the press. You have a vivid civil society, and people don't go to jail for their opinions and the like. Actually, I believe that Tunisia, after they got rid of Ben Ali, and this is something that they managed to do because there was a sort of social alliance between the truly disinherited, as you would say in the States, and the middle class. They both wanted to get rid of the dictator, which was just irrelevant on top of being cruel and inept. And then there was a compromise that was searched in Tunisia. Originally, the Islamist party Ennahda managed to win at the first free elections in October 2011 because they were the only player on the political field that was able to rein in the riffraff, as they would say from an upper class point of view, i.e., to keep some social order. And this is why part of the Tunisian middle class, even the secularists, decided that they would back this sort of neo-Muslim brother or moderate Muslim brother group because they could manage to keep the country going. Nahda, in a coalition with leftist parties, did not really fare very well and was unable to face the challenge of Islamist and jihadi terrorism. Jihadists linked to ISIS managed to kill a number of Tunisian politicians, foreigners, and the like, soldiers, policemen. And then the Islamists, left power and were replaced by a secularist group. And nowadays you have a sort of blend between moderate Islamists and moderate secularists who rule the country. This is a sort of balance of power which is okay because many people identify with this government or do not identify with the government, but this is not great to make decisions and to live up to the huge challenges of the country. So in a way, Tunisia came out rather well. because there's freedom of speech, you don't go to jail, you whatever for your opinions and the like. There are democratic institutions, but the economy is sluggish, and as a contrast to nearby Morocco, for instance, where uh, it's a different political system, but nevertheless there are many more job opportunities. And Tunisia, which has a vibrant academic system and still some good universities for the Arab world in comparison, sees most of its graduates get out and find jobs in Europe if they can, but as it's more and more difficult, go to Morocco and be employed there.
Let me ask you a kind of macro question as we're talking about what was called the Arab Spring. Do you see the movements, the popular demonstrations, and all that's unfolded since 2010, December 2010 in Tunisia, and then 2011 and after, as any type of verdict on the role of political Islam or the nature of governance and how the states were organized in the Arab world? And if so, what is that verdict and how does that carry forward, do you think?
Well, originally, the young people who started the movements in all of those countries had nothing to do with political Islam. They were liberal, they were postmodern, they were what have you. They were not interested in those religious issues. But as soon as the authoritarian states started to be toppled one after the other, it soon became obvious that those young people were not very deeply rooted in society. It was a thin veneer. They looked good on TV. They sort of like occupied Tahrir Square, which was okay for close shots. And in Egypt, if you're 100,000 people, you're close up. But there are 100 million people in the background which you don't see. And those did not really identify with that. They had sort of deeper affiliations with the Sufi brotherhoods, with the Muslim brothers, with the Salafist groups, with the army. And because those movements were not that deeply rooted, actually they were ousted from power as of late 2011, beginning of 2012. And you had more sort of ingrained, deeper political or religious movements that came to the front. And the same happened also in Syria, where originally the rebellion was sort of a pan-Syrian. You had, of course, a majority of Sunnis, but you also have some liberal Alawis, some Christians, some Shia and the like, some Druze. But after a while, it became, to a large extent, only a Sunni movement against the minorities. And this movement was sort of hijacked by jihadi groups, Islamist and then jihadi groups, because Arabian Peninsula countries saw in the eventual victory of the Sunni rebellion in Syria an opportunity to break the sort of Iranian outreach from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea through South Beirut or Tartus or Latakia. And this was, I think, not well perceived and well understood particularly in the West, because we still dreamed about rebels who were the forebearers of democratic visions and who would topple the dictatorships of the region and so on and so forth. People still, at the beginning of the Arab upheavals, thought of it as a sort of duplication or the 1989 movements in the former Soviet Eastern Europe. But the political culture was different. And so there was a lot of disillusion. Nowadays, after a decade of war, of failures, of civil wars in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, to name a few, I believe there is a desire to find some sort of a solution, because the horror of the war, of civil war, of people being bombed, being tortured, and everything by most warring factions, antagonist factions, is such a trauma that there has to be a way forward. Also, if we talk about nowadays, the global balance of the Middle East has changed. Oil was the name of the game, has been such since the October War of 1973, and after the Arab oil embargo. And nowadays, oil is unable to deal with the challenges of a region which has gone through a huge demographic expansion. Think that there are 100 million Egyptians now. And if there is no post-oil vision, the whole area is going to sink. And this is the challenge which is taken up by Saudi Arabia, among others, the Emirates also, Qatar to some extent, but they have a very small population. And in that, we see that the political language of Islam, which was the key to social peace in the oil era, and which nurtured the competition between conservative Sunni Islamism in Saudi Arabia and so-called revolutionary Shia Islamism in Tehran, is now becoming increasingly irrelevant. What will this lead to? I don't know, but I believe we are really at, this is a watershed period for the Middle East. Its place in the world system will not be as it was, and it is now facing its destiny, its relation with Europe, which is in its neighborhood much more than America, and there's a new era that opens in front of us. Think also, after the virus pandemics and the fact that everybody was suddenly discovered that, you had no masks, you had no toilet paper, you had no medicine, because all this came from the Chinese supply chain. Now there is this feeling that, you should sort of come into a process of reshoring, I think you say in America, of relocalization in your neighborhood. And this may be a chance for an opportunity for countries in the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean. To what extent, now that the price of labor is lower in Morocco than it is in China, for instance. So why would you go to China if you can have the same job done in Morocco or in Tunisia or in Egypt, maybe tomorrow in Lebanon and Syria? And this is already what Turkey had started before Mr. Erdogan went in the direction he went into. And so here we have maybe the possibility of your future and post-oil Middle East and North Africa. And this is a crucial issue, particularly in a post-virus world where you see new fault lines between America and Europe, between America and China. Well, of course, this depends a lot on who's going to be re-elected president in America in November. But the Middle East challenges are part and parcel of that global picture to a large extent.
Gilles, I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia. These trends you've described so eloquently here in our interview and in your book. Um, how are they playing out in the kingdom, including the Vision 2030 efforts to reform the economy by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman? What do you anticipate for the future of the kingdom, both internally and its role in the region?
Well, everybody now is accountable to the way the virus challenge has been dealt with. And Saudi Arabia coped with the challenge at a very early stage. And if you compare Saudi Arabia and Iran, for instance, in Iran, Khamenei, who's largely dependent on the religious establishment, not only on the RCG or Pasdaran, could do nothing but let pilgrims flock to the holy sites of Mecca, Qom, Mashhad, and you know, everybody was together, and they would kiss the tombs and lick and strike and everything, which was a perfect recipe for the tremendous spread of the virus. And this is why Iran was hardly hit from the very start. So because they have very close relations with China, who are, you know, they buy a lot of Iranian oil at a bargain price. So there are many Chinese there. In a contrast, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was able to take the decision not to give any visa for Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage, sorry. And now there are words around that there is a rumor that the Hajj itself may not take place because of the pandemics. And this, of course, is a major issue in the competition between the ulama, who have been severely weakened of late, the Wahhabi ulama, and the ruling family. So, will the Crown Prince be able to deliver economically or not is too early to say. Some of the mega projects, like the Neom computer city, sorry, on the northwest part of the kingdom, are probably challenged because they cost a lot of money. But at least what the pandemics have shown is that you know, a number of rulers were able to get rid of religious pressure, even, you know, when with such issues as Ramadan, which took place during the pandemics, like for instance in Morocco, no one could get out for iftar, and if you did so, you know, you would really be in serious trouble. The fact that the Crown Prince was able to suspend or visas, and probably is not going to allow for Hajj, also shows that for the time being he has the upper hand, and he does not fear religious retribution. You know, even in my country, France, during our lockdown, people could not go to church, mosques, or synagogues and everything for you know, sanitary reasons. But a number of Salafists congregated, got together in apartments, saying that this issue of virus had nothing to do with medicine. This was a law that punished infidels and heretics. This is why Iran was, in their view, particularly hit, and that the only way to get out of it was prayer and getting together. And this, of course, is something that challenges, you know, the Moroccan authorities, the Saudi authorities. For the time being, I believe they have won politically, at least this stage. Now, the real challenge will be the economic issues afterwards, employment, unemployment, the capacity to emigrate, and so on. But as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, as of today, I believe the COVID-19 situation has been dealt with, and it's a big issue, for a number of countries of the region to show that you have been able to cope and that you could assess firmly the capacity of the powers that be to be in control.
Gilles, you've been a thought leader and scholar on the front lines of the West's and Europe's engagement with political Islam. And when I say front lines, I mean it literally and figuratively. As you mentioned earlier, ISIS targeted you for assassination back in 2016 for your scholarship on the region. How do you see the evolution and relationship between political Islam and the West today? And where do you see it going?
Well, depending what you call Islam, quote unquote, because in Europe now you have millions of people who are European citizens and who are from Muslim descent. Some of them are indifferent to their religious heritage, like many Europeans are indifferent to their Christian or Jewish heritage, and sort of blends into a secular citizenship. Others consider that this is important to them, and even on the social and political level. And others turn that into, fascination for ISIS or what have you. But fortunately, a small minority, but in my country, France, we suffered severe attacks, and we were also the first exporter of jihadists to Syria at a European level. So I believe that the ISIS phenomenon is now much quieter because the ISIS structure was destroyed by Western bombing, while Kurds on the one hand and Iraqi Shias on the other were the foot soldiers for the attacks against ISIS. And from what I judge from my students, who do interviews with jihadis in our jails, the guys there still believe that the ideal was okay, but the method was unconclusive, and they're trying to find out another way to mobilize the masses on their behalf. I don't think they will succeed. I mean, as such, they're a spent force, but we see new fault lines coming out, and the social movements that are now based on the race, that have torn America, and which are now also coming to Europe after George Floyd's assassination, are important to study, because for the time being, they remain largely outside the scope of any religion. But a number of Islamist militants are trying to use those revolts in order to say that, this is because the kuffar or the infidels are racist, because in Europe they're inheritors of the colonial empire, and they're trying to find a sort of new legitimacy in the hijacking of those revolt movement against the police brutality. So this is something also to watch and to follow. For the time being, they have not really succeeded, but because we're still in the moment of enthusiasm, in a way, that is to say, like it's an expression by Karl Marx, a moment of enthusiasm when different social and racial groups blend together. How will it go? How long will it last? This is a big issue for America first, because we don't know to what extent this will help undermine President Trump's re-election, or on the contrary, help him gather people who are frightened by the revolts and take them to the voting booth. But these, there is no such thing as a reconciled society. I mean, political society is always divided into fault lines. And when the parliament of representatives or whatever becomes too conservative, or too separate from the real stakes in society, then you have street politics. And this is one of the things that I guess we have to keep a close eye onto, because one thing now, which is very different from my youth in the 1970s, is that everything is global. And kids who demonstrated against police brutality in the streets of Paris or London or Rome had seen the agony of George Floyd on their telephone, something which did not exist. I recall when I was in Egypt in the early 1980s, I would, handpick leaflets by radical Islamists. I mean, there was no. I mean, nowadays it's an issue of a click. So we live in a world which is far more globalized, and where emotions travel much faster. Whether emotions can last and can develop into an organized movement, well, this is the big challenge. But there are many entrepreneurs, be they secular or religious, who are interested in joining the bandwagon.
Gilles, last question. As a professor and scholar who continues to influence so many students of the region, what do you advise aspiring students, scholars, journalists, those looking to get involved in the Middle East? I mean, is it more challenging than in the past, as urgent as in the past? And what do you see the trends among the young people that you come across in the field who are interested in the region?
Well, of course, the first thing I would recommend is that they grab a copy of Away from Chaos and read it through. But I don't know if, the young people are that interested in things past. There is this feeling that, because we live in this sort of flat world, to quote from Tom Friedman, that they believe that things happen, and they tend not to understand that things are deeply rooted. Like, this was probably the disillusion of the so-called Arab Springs, when everybody was fascinated with those young people on Tahrir Square in Cairo, or Avenue Bourguiba in Tunis, or wherever, or Sahat al-Lulu in Bahrain, and only to discover that this was not deeply rooted. So my feeling is that they, in order to understand the present, let alone predict the future, it is important to put the past, or the recent past, into perspective. And this is what I aim to do, based both on the observation of things, because I was an academic, and I still am one for a few years only, and I was also a witness at the times, sometimes a participant, and I've tried to put all that into a global perspective, and this is the kind of challenge I believe that many of us face now, and if we can be as objective as possible, and and sort of get rid of ideology to deal with the situation in the Middle East and North Africa. This, I believe, will already be a major step forward compared to what was the case when I was younger.
Professor Gilles Kepel, author of Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West, published just this year, just last month in May by Columbia University Press. It's available on Amazon and elsewhere. Gilles, thank you for joining us today on the Middle East.
Thank you so much.
I will be right back with some concluding thoughts after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
Welcome back to On the Middle East. Well, Gilles Kepel, in both our conversation and in his latest book, Away from Chaos, reminds us of the value of perspective. Those seeking to understand the new fault lines and trends in the Middle East will be at a loss if they don't know and understand the old fault lines. You can't know where you're going if you don't know where you are and how you got there. Now, Gilles also offered us numerous insights and takeaways about the evolving trends, what's happening now, looking ahead into the future, including the inability of oil resources alone to meet the expansive demographic and economic demands of the region, the increasing irrelevance of the discourse of political Islam for governance, the pressure governments in the region are feeling to be accountable for how they manage the COVID-19 crisis, and the shifting role of the Middle East in the global system. I was also taken with Gilles' point about how the rapid connectiveness of the region has produced both solidarity with those in the US and the West protesting against racism and police brutality, especially among younger people in the region, but also an opportunity for Islamist leaders and militants to find a new legitimacy, as Gilles said, in hijacking these emotions. Thanks again to our guest, Professor Gilles Kepel. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, and thank you for listening to On the Middle East. And please tune in next week and sign up for our Al Monitor podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.